次に FAO アジア太平洋地域事務所の上級エコノミストであるデイビッド・ドウさんに特別講演として、コロナ禍がアジア地域の食料栄養バランスに与える影響についてお話しいただき、デイビッドさんはこれまでハーバード大学国際開発研究所と国際稲研究所に勤務し、アジアの食料政策に多く関わり、貿易と市場、国内価格政策、生産と水資源、および栄養に関わる書籍と論文を多く出版してきました。それではデイビッドさん、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. I think it's still morning in Japan for a few more minutes. What's happened to economic growth in the region? These are the latest numbers from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. On the far left, you can see that they estimate the global economy contracted by 3.1% in 2020. And there were contractions in all of the different parts of the world, the United States, the Euro area, the Middle East and Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean. Percent decline in GDP in Fiji, big declines in the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and also Papua New Guinea. And then also in South Asia, the pattern is consistent there. Relatively good growth in 2019, but lots of big negative red bars showing negative economic growth in 2020. These declines in GDP led to losses of jobs, lots of back migration into rural areas, and it made it, and this constrained people's ability to access food. Not only they had much more trouble affording food, and especially food that was more nutritious and maybe more expensive. So some very poor families might not be able to eat at all. I'll show you the numbers on some of that later. Other families may have had to reduce the number of times they could eat meat or fruits and vegetables and in their diets, and they simply had to eat more staple food, more rice, which is not nearly as nutritious as a balanced diet. So this big change in contraction in GDP in 2020 was the biggest story, but there were many other important things happening as well. One thing that many of you may have heard about is that prices on world food markets surged to very high levels starting about the middle of 2020. So if we look at the FAO Food Price Index, since May of 2020 until today, it's increased by 47%, which is a very big increase. Now, the biggest increases were in vegetable oils, where prices more than doubled, and also in sugar. But we also saw big increases in cereals, like rice and wheat, in dairy, where there was a 33% increase in prices. And also meat had the smallest increase of any of the subcategories of food, but it was still substantial, 15%. Now these increases started from May. Now that suggests May of 2020. Now that suggests also, well, they started in May in 2020, and then even after several months into June, July, August, September, October, prices were not, as of October, the FAO Food Price Index was basically at the same level as it was before the pandemic hit. So what that does is that suggests to you that these big increases in prices on world food markets were not due to COVID. They were not due to the pandemic. They were due to other reasons. So for example, there was bad weather in many countries. There was drought in the United States and Canada. There was also dry weather in Brazil that led to delays in planting and then exposed the subsequent crop to frost problems. There's also, in addition to the bad weather that we saw in many places, there have been rising oil and energy prices. Now, these have a couple of effects. First of all, energy prices affect production costs directly. When farmers need to use tractors, it costs more for their fuel. Rising energy prices also affect the prices of fertilizer. And so fertilizer prices have been going up quite a bit lately. In fact, some countries have blocked exports of fertilizers as a result, some of the exporting countries. In addition to rising production costs, there's also linkages between energy prices and food prices because of biofuels demand. So when the price of crude oil goes up, as it has been over that period from May 2020 to the present, as crude oil prices increase, that increases the then many people want to switch to biofuels made from food. Like, for example, in the United States, the most common biofuel feedstock is maize. So as crude oil prices go up, then so do maize prices, because there's more demand for biofuel. And when maize prices go up, that means farmers start to shift into maize, and they shift out of soybeans, which causes soybean prices to go up. And so there's very close linkages between world energy markets and world food markets. So in addition to the bad weather that we had in many countries, rising oil and energy prices have also contributed to higher food prices on international markets. Now, COVID's had some effect too, but before, one other thing I'd like to mention that's not in my slide here is there was also in China, as African swine fever disappeared, there's been a lot of demand to rebuild hog herds in China over this period in the second half of 2020. And so that's also led to upward pressure on world market food prices. Now, there were some effects due to the virus, but they're compared to these other factors, I think they were relatively minor. In some countries had labor shortages because of the virus. Now, in many countries, there were actually labor surpluses in rural areas as people lost their jobs in urban areas, went back to join their families in rural areas. So in many countries, there were labor surpluses. But in some countries, for example, like Malaysia, a lot of the workers who work on oil palm plantations are from Indonesia. And when the virus broke out, a lot of these people left and went back to Indonesia. And so then there became labor shortages in some wealthier countries like Malaysia. So there were some impacts of the pandemic and the virus on world market food prices, but they were relatively minor compared to the other factors. In addition, another factor that led to some increased world food market prices, but again, probably less important than the bad weather and the rising energy prices, was there were policies that restricted exports of food in some countries. And let me explain a little bit about that now. So in the case of rice, export restrictions temporarily put pressure on the world rice market in 2020. So you can see kind of in March here, in late March, Vietnam put a ban on new export registrations. They didn't ban exports, actually. They just banned the registration process, which is necessary to export later. So exports were still leaving in March, but as exporters realized that they wouldn't be able to register for new exports, there was a bit of a panic. And so when that ban was announced, prices shot way up in early April here. And they increased by about 20% in just a couple of weeks all because of this export restriction policy. Thankfully, when that happened, and it wasn't only Vietnam, I should say. Myanmar also started to put some export quotas on their rice exports, and Cambodia started to restrict a little bit of their non-aromatic rice, although that's a minor export from Cambodia, actually. But several countries were putting these export restrictions on, and that's why prices went up like this very quickly. But then the countries changed their policies and they went back and decided not to restrict exports, thankfully. First of all, the first thing is Vietnam. They, instead of banning new export registrations, they put a new quota on export registrations, and the quota was somewhat reasonable. It was reasonably large. And so when that happened, prices fell down almost immediately. Then just a couple of weeks later, Vietnam said, oh, never mind, we're not going to even have quotas on export registrations. And as soon as that happened, the price came down again. So it's good that these countries did that. Now you may wonder why these countries changed their policies, because in the 2008 food crisis, the export restrictions were much stronger. But I think hopefully some countries have learned from those mistakes. And there's also disadvantages even for the exporting country in banning exports. The motivation, of course, for the exporting country is to make sure that they have enough food in their own country. They care less about supplying other countries. They want to make sure they have food at home. That's an understandable impulse, but there's also disadvantages to restricting exports. And I think that's what Vietnam realized. For example, when Vietnam restricts exports of rice, what that does is that makes the domestic price of rice in their own country go way down, which hurts their farmers. So that's one reason they decided to restore exports and allow them again. It also, when they ban exports, export registrations, it also causes problems for them because they can lose market share to other countries. And this is in fact what happened to Thailand in 2011. Thailand used to be the world's biggest exporter of rice, but then they indirectly started to restrict exports. They were trying to stockpile rice. They were trying to raise prices. They were trying to get higher prices for their farmers. But when they did that, other countries came in, and India started to become a very big exporter. And ever since Thailand indirectly restricted exports back in 2011, they're not the world's biggest exporter of rice anymore. India has taken market share from them in a very big way. The other disadvantage to restricting exports for exporting countries is it gives them a bad reputation with importing countries. Importing countries then don't trust them, and then they try to expand their own production, and then that hurts the farmers in the exporting country. So some of these factors are the reasons why I think Vietnam decided to, and eventually Cambodia and Myanmar, they eventually abandoned, got rid of their export restrictions. So thankfully this could have been much worse, but thankfully good policies to keep international trade open prevailed. Just to also give you a little perspective on that, and that increase, this is the increase that we were just talking about. So you can see it was very big if you focus on the first half of 2020, but if you look at the whole period from 2005 to 2021, over a long period, this was only a small increase, a small blip. It was nothing like the price increase that we saw in 2008 and 2011, times like that. So it was a relatively small increase this time. Now, I want to discuss a little bit here and move away from the discussion of world market food prices and talk about the domestic agricultural sector in various countries in the region. So despite the negative economic growth that we saw in almost all countries, as I mentioned earlier, the agricultural sector actually grew in most countries in the region. 3/4 of countries in the region showed positive agricultural sector growth in 2020. For the industrial sector, only 30% of countries had positive growth. And for the services sector, only 15% of countries had positive growth. So this shows the growth in GDP by sector in 2020 for 20 countries in the region. So we see the median agricultural sector growth was actually 2.8% positive. That was the typical growth for a country's agricultural sector in the region. So there was still an expansion. If you look at industry and services, those contracted by 4% or more in the case of services. So we see that agriculture was relatively less affected. This is in some ways not a surprise. It's because people still have to eat food. So when economic growth slows down, people have less money to spend on things. They stop buying cars, they stop buying television sets, they stop buying motorcycles. They don't stop buying food unless they're really poor. And I'll get back to those impacts on food security and nutrition later. But the point is that the agricultural sector did really well. Now, some or typical, very well compared to industry and services. Now, there were some countries that had negative agricultural growth. Malaysia, as I mentioned, had some problems with oil palm production due to labor shortages. Myanmar, there was a coup. Sri Lanka had a ban on imports of fertilizer for a while, so that created some problems. And the Philippines and Samoa, their growth was only slightly negative, and it's just, in any given year, the agricultural sector in some countries will have negative growth just because of bad weather. But the overall picture was agriculture did much better than industry and services. Now, the same thing was true for international trade, actually. At the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of concern that international trade would just collapse. And some forecasts were forecasting maybe a 20 or even 30% reduction. In the end, the contraction in international trade was much less. The WTO estimates that total merchandise exports in 2020 declined by 7.7% in 2020. A big decline, but not nearly as bad as it was expected to be. And for agricultural exports, they actually increased by about 1% compared to a decline in overall trade of 7.7%. So just like in GDP, also in international trade, agriculture was less affected than were industry and services. Now let me go back to prices. But now the prices that I were talking about were international world market prices. Those are not the prices that all of us pay when we go to the market or the supermarket or the store. So now I want to talk about domestic food prices. So this little table here shows the cumulative percentage increase in food prices adjusted for general inflation for 41 economies in the region. The median increase from December of 2019 to December of 2020 was about 3.7%, faster than overall inflation. So there was an increase, but it was not that big. And if we extend it to June of 2021, Actually, you can see that the increase was less because prices started to decline from December 2020 to June of 2021. So despite the rapid increases in world market food prices, domestic food price inflation has been much less. Why is that? Well, most food in Asia is not imported. Now, Japan's an exception, as Koyama-san pointed out earlier. But for most countries in Asia, most of their food is produced domestically. And domestic agriculture, remember, experienced positive growth. So that contributed to stable domestic food prices in many countries. It's also important to realize that when you buy food at the supermarket, you're not just paying for the cost of the food, you're paying for the cost of the transport, you're paying for the cost of the labor that loads and unloads things, you're paying for the cost of the workers at the supermarket or the traditional market. And those costs did not increase by as much as international food prices. So that was another factor that helped to control domestic food prices. I think policies also played a very important role. Governments quickly realized that there was great potential for disruption to food supply chains. And so countries declared food and agriculture to be essential services. This was and helped facilitate the movement of food around the country despite all the lockdowns that occurred due to the virus. There was also very good collaboration, I think, between public and private sectors. The public and private sectors worked together in many countries to identify where the bottlenecks in the food supply chains were and to resolve them quickly so that there weren't problems. Now, that doesn't mean that, of course, some farmers had to dump their produce or weren't able to sell it. But what amazed me is how infrequent, how uncommon those episodes were. Overall, domestic food prices were very, very stable. And the evidence clearly shows that in almost all countries in the region. So I'd like to summarize here what I've said so far. There was a substantial economic contraction in most countries. Food prices on international markets increased sharply, but the increases were due to factors other than the virus. Fortunately, domestic food prices have been relatively stable so far when compared to international market price changes, but future trends are not clear. We've been having some big problems with fertilizer prices recently. If oil prices were to shoot up more, there could be some problems for domestic food prices. And I would now like to talk about the impact on food security and nutrition of these changes. Well, mainly because of the contraction in income, we saw the largest deterioration of undernourishment in 20 years in Asia and the Pacific. So we saw from 2019, the prevalence of undernourishment was about 7.5%, and it increased to 8.7% in just 1 year, an increase of more than 1 percentage point. Now, you might, if we look in broader historical perspective, that's not that big a deal. But 1 percentage point in Asia and the Pacific means more than 50 million people began to suffer from undernourishment. 50 million is a lot of people. Another way that FAO measures food insecurity is through surveys of people. And FAO estimates that the number of people suffering from severe or moderate food insecurity in Asia and the Pacific increased by 149 million people in 2020. A very, very big increase. And so what this means is people are not able to, some days they might have to go without food. That's what severe food insecurity means. And then moderate food insecurity means that maybe people have to skip a meal. They can't buy the food that they want to buy. They're uncertain if they'll be able to get food next week or tomorrow. So this is a big increase, 149 million people in the region, mainly because of the problems in income and lost jobs, but it was also exacerbated by some rise in domestic food prices. So the future policy responses to make sure that we can bring food insecurity back down and hopefully get it to zero for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We'll need to continue to control spread of the virus and implement physical distancing in food supply chains so that viral outbreaks don't spread among food service workers. We're probably going to have to expand social protection, especially for the poor and vulnerable. And this is a big problem, especially in poorer countries that don't have enough money to do this. We need to continue to focus on public-private cooperation to solve supply chain disruptions as they arise. I think we did a good job of that collectively in 2020. We need to continue doing that going forward. We also need to continue to keep international trade open as much as possible. It's understandable why some countries want to restrict it, but I hope they also realize that it also causes some problems for their own farmers and also damages their reputation on international markets. And of course, it's also important for food importing countries, as Japan is very well aware. And then we need to build more flexible and resilient food systems. In the past, there was more of a reliance on just in time kind of deliveries, where the amount of food that was kept in storage was maybe somewhat small. So countries and private firms are maybe going to want to store more food than they have in the past so that their food system is resilient to short-term shocks and there's not big shortages of food. And if companies behave like this will also give consumers more confidence and lead to less panic in food supply chains. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much for your attention.
デイビッドさん、ありがとうございました。まず、ドウ博士、お願いいたします。
Yeah, thank you very much. I wanted to talk a little, just to take a little bit broader perspective and talk about the really the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals and FAO and the rest of the world community. It's really important to make sure that by 2030 we can eradicate hunger and malnutrition. And to do this, I think our agri-food systems will need to be transformed to become more inclusive, more resilient to things like COVID-19, more sustainable, and they need to supply much more nutritious foods. To do that with COVID-19, I'd just like to, I guess, reiterate some of the things that I mentioned earlier. It really needs to be a very holistic approach to improve food security. So first of all, we have to improve our health systems to control the spread of the virus, and implement physical distancing in supply chains so that for example, meat production doesn't slow down because we had some of these meat packing plants having to close because of the spread of the virus. So making sure that food service workers practice proper distancing, are fully vaccinated, and all those kinds of things. That will be very important for making sure that our food systems function well. I think it'll be important to also expand social protection. This is also not really part of food systems, but it's very important for eradicating hunger and malnutrition, especially in the face of pandemics. In the past, when there was big economic shocks, many people would go back to rural areas, and agriculture sector played kind of a buffer role that would allow people's livelihoods to continue. But as the economies of Asia are getting richer, agriculture is becoming a smaller and smaller part of the economy. So agriculture will play less and less of a role as a social protection mechanism when people lose their jobs. And so we need to have improved social protection systems also, just like improved health systems, if we're going to eradicate hunger and malnutrition. We still need to have a lot of public-private cooperation, as I mentioned earlier. Just one example of that here in Thailand, where I live and work. The private and the public sector cooperated very well. They had meetings on a daily basis, different committees, to make sure that supply chain bottlenecks were solved and without affecting people. They did a very good job of that. And it's also important to keep international trade open, especially for importing countries, but also even for exporting countries. We need to keep international trade flowing that allows, every person in every country to get access to the good, nutritious food that they need. So those are my observations. Thank you very much.
ドクター・デイビッド、ありがとうございました。そうですね、コロナ、気候変動、それよりももっと大きく捉えて、2030年までに SDG を達成する、飢餓の撲滅を達成するには、もっと持続的で包括的で強靭性のあるフードシステムを構築し、栄養のある食料をすべての人たちに提供できるようにしなければいけない。そのためには、バリューチェーンステークホルダーが、リスク、そうですね、ショックに対して対応できるようなシステム、社会保険システム、プライベートパブリックパートナーシップ、また国際貿易のアクセスを保障する措置など、いろいろな措置を考えられると思います。どうもありがとうございました。